So now I'd like to introduce you to your co-host for this lesson. First up is Andy Beahrs. Andy is CCE's Strategic Partnerships Coordinator. Andy, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I live in Berkeley, California, which makes me a member of the Alameda County chapter. I've been with the organization for about 8 months now, but have been a volunteer for considerably longer. I guess this will be my third international conference this June, and I can't wait.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Next up for tonight, doing the facilitation is Mark Reynolds. He's the voice you hear on our monthly international conference calls. Mark is Citizen Climate Lobby and Citizen Climate Education's Executive Director. Mark, would you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, in addition to hosting the monthly call, I'm the designer of CCL and CCE's curriculum and also the architect of what we call the CCL way, the whole admiration, gratitude, respect. That was stuff that I designed into the organization.
Awesome. And that's me. My name is Ricky Bradley, and I'm group leader for the Dallas, Texas chapter of CCL, and sometimes I mess around with our IT stuff as well. All right, so let's take a look real quick at our lobbying webinar roadmap to see what we've covered so far, and then I'll show you also where you can find the previous lessons. So in Lobbying 101, we discussed the basics of Congress, what it's like to lobby as a citizen, what are really our most valuable tools as a lobbyist, and just to refresh you, that is information on how our policy will impact a member's district. And we talked about building relationships as well, what it's like building a relationship with a member of Congress. In 201, we talked about preparing yourself for a meeting with a member of Congress. We talked about the research you can do, the roles you can be assigned, and really the benefits of practicing. In Lobbying 301, which was last week, we talked about the meeting outline. We demonstrated a couple of meetings, and we talked about some really important meeting elements as well. So I would encourage everyone to go back and listen to that lesson. And then tonight, again, we're going to talk about handling difficult situations and some advanced lobbying skills. So first, before we do that, let me just show you real quick where you can find all the lobbying lessons in case you want to go back and listen and you don't know. So on CCL Community, you should see Community on your screen right now. And at the top, there's a menu bar. And in the menu bar, one of the options you can select is CCU. When you click on CCU, it takes you to the CCU page, which is Citizens Climate University. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see there are different learning objectives. By clicking on different ones, you can see the lessons that are revealed underneath. And you can see here are all our lobbying lessons that are available. But there's also, all kinds of different lessons available as well. And then the other place you can find our lessons would be on our Podbean channel. So this is our podcasting channel. You can see if you go to podbean.com, ccl.podbean.com, you can see there's some lessons there. It's also where we host our monthly calls. And then if you go to iTunes and search for Citizens Climate Lobby, you can subscribe to our pod channel as well. All of these podcasts are the same ones that are on our Podbean channel. And for those of you who like to watch, you can go to our YouTube channel. And it's just, you can search for Citizens Climate Lobby on YouTube and click the playlist option here in the menu. And when you do, all the lessons are segmented, and you can click on the Citizens Climate University playlist to see all of our previous lessons. Okay, so let's get back to what we're doing tonight and go back to the slides. Oops, there we go. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to review a few things. Common objections to carbon fee and dividend, and we're going to demonstrate some bad, good, and better responses. We're going to talk about some common temptations with lobbying, some of the things you probably should stay away from. We'll talk about hot button issues and how, when they come up, how you can recover and get focused back on why we are there. How to handle some other difficult situations that are rare, but every once in a while they pop up. And then Andy's going to wrap up with speaking or telling us a little bit about how to handle pushback from like-minded members of Congress, folks who might be inclined to act on climate, but maybe they have a different policy that they like. So let's get started with Mark and Andy demonstrating how to overcome some common objections to carbon fee and dividend. And Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. So Andy and I are going to go through some examples of some of the most common things you can expect to come up. So for instance, what about China? 2 years ago, that was the single biggest issue that came up in lobby meetings. Problems with specifically the word tax, and then also the disbelief that the policy actually will be revenue neutral. These topics, they can either forward your meeting or they can derail it, and what we're hoping to do is to demonstrate a bad response, something that will likely get the meeting going in the wrong direction, a good response, and then a better response to each of those common problems so you have an idea of what you might say and what you might do in these situations. One thing just to remember is it's important that we're paying attention to the people we're actually talking to. Sometimes we have ideas about what we think they're going to say, what they think they're interested in, and so it's important that we're responding to what they actually say, not what we think that they're going to say. So for the start of this session, Andy and I are going to take turns, with one of us being a member of Congress and the other one being a CCL volunteer. When we get through each section, then Randy will debrief the session. So the first we're going to start with is Andy's going to be a staffer who raises the concern regarding China. So
Mark,
what about China and India? Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
So, Mark, it doesn't matter what we're doing because China and India are burning so much coal.
A lot of Republicans fail to acknowledge what China is doing. So that's pretty obviously a bad response, everybody. Let's have him ask the same question and see if we can come up with a good response.
Mark, it doesn't matter what we're doing because China and India are burning so much coal.
China and India are really important. The good thing about our policy proposal is no matter what they do or don't do, we're going to end up with more jobs, we're going to increase our competitiveness, our air and the water in our district is going to be cleaner. So that's a good response, right? It sounds like I've been practicing laser talks and I've internalized it and I can respond to it. Now let's see if we can come up with a better response.
Mark, it doesn't matter what we're doing because China and India are burning so much coal.
That's a valid concern, Andy. Would you tell me more about why that's an issue for you?
Sure. We see it this way. If the U.S. is the only country eliminating coal jobs and coal as an energy source, then China and India are just free riding at our expense. And we can't ever stop global warming by ourselves.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, I think, is that you're saying if there was some way to bring China and India along, then it would be much easier for this office to support climate action. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, but there's a lot of other issues we'd have to overcome as well.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, Andy. Getting back to China and India, I had the same concern, and then I heard about how Reagan used a border adjustment to bring other countries along when combating the hole in the ozone. Would you like to hear more about what Reagan did to eliminate free riders? Ricky?
There we go. I'm sorry, I was talking. I had muted myself. I apologize. Okay, so at this point, Andy would answer, yes, Mark, of course. I want to hear more about what you heard from Reagan or what your, what Reagan did to eliminate free riders. So let's debrief that real quick. So notice that Mark's better response, what he started with really was an acknowledgement, and he followed that with a question. Mark said, that's a valid concern, Andy. Would you tell me more about why that matters to you? So what this did is this led to Mark discovering really that Andy's underlying issue or value associated with this was that China and India would free ride. So then our responses, if you'll notice to Andy's comment that it doesn't matter what we do because China and India burning so much coal, have gone from a bad response of, a lot of Republicans failed to acknowledge what climate is doing to a better response, which is acknowledging, yeah, China and India are important and telling them a little bit about our policy and why we think it's better. But really, the best thing that happened was, and the better response, is that we asked questions, we listened for values so that we were able to find common ground. And we found out what the real issue was. So notice that with the bad and even the good response, we told them what we wanted them to hear. It's only after we asked clarifying questions and listened did we respond to the value underlying their concern, which was free riders. All right, so our next topic is the taboo surrounding the word tax. And in this example, Mark is going to play the member of Congress, and Andy is going to play our Citizens Climate Lobby volunteer.
Okay, so Andy, you call this a fee, but it's really just another tax.
No, it's a fee, not a tax, if all the money goes back to households. So that's a bad response, and here's a good response.
Okay, so Andy, you call this a fee, but it's really just a tax.
Former Secretary of State Schultz says that if the net proceeds are returned to households, then it's a fee, not a tax, because taxes pay for government, and this fee is not doing that. And remember, not only did Mr. Schultz serve for 4 administrations, but he was also the chairman of the economics department at the University of Chicago. So that's a good response, but here's an even better one.
Okay, so Andy, you keep calling this a fee to me, but it's just another tax.
I've had that same concern, Congressman. I'm pretty fiscally conservative myself. Would you like to tell me what I've learned?
Sure.
Well, have I ever told you that President Reagan's former Secretary of State and Treasury Secretary George Shultz is on our advisory board?
I think you told me that last time.
Well, Secretary Shultz tells us that if we offset the fee revenue minus any administrative costs with corresponding rebates to American households, then we're not technically raising revenue to fund government programs. What's your take on that?
Oh, sounds like semantics to me, but there's a lot of semantics in governing.
I've got to agree with that. And there are some other economists, like Romney's former economic advisor Greg Mankiw, who believe that we have to put the cost of reducing emissions onto the balance sheets of the producers. And that's exactly what our fee is designed to do.
Okay, so let's stop and debrief here again. Now notice that Andy's better response started by, again, acknowledging and really this time sharing the member of Congress's concern. Andy said, hey, I've had that same concern, Congressman. I'm conservative myself. Would you like for me to tell you what I've learned? So in this example, Andy didn't really ask a lot of questions. He just found common ground right away and connected on values by sharing that concern. So in this example, our responses to Mark's comment about, this is really just another tax have gone from an argument over semantics, hey, if you give all the money back, you can call it a fee, which is a pretty bad response, to a better response of, hey, former Secretary of State, maybe that's someone that they respect, so giving them a validator and telling them what they think. But really to a better response occurs when Andy connects on his values and then really asks for permission to proceed so that we can give them our take or what we've learned. Now, one other important thing here before we move on to the next one is we should really recognize and appreciate that the context within which Congress operates right now, that revenue coming into the government is a really tricky issue, especially for Republicans. So when they've told you that they are ready to hear what you have to say, you might find it appropriate then to talk about some gains and cite some gains from the REMI study. So really what you're doing, if you can see, is you're taking the congressmen or moving them from a conversation from something that really scares them, which is the word tax, right, to a positive message of something that really resonates with them. Now our next topic is the concern that carbon fee and dividend will never be revenue neutral. In this example, Andy's going to play the member of Congress and Mark is the CCL volunteer.
We won't vote for this because we don't believe it could ever be truly revenue neutral after it gets through the lobbyists.
Okay, let me just say we're calling this a bad answer, but as Donald Trump would say, this is a tremendous answer. Okay, so what you're telling me, Andy, is we can't trust you with the money. Okay. I wrote that exclusively because I've always wanted to say it, and I thought it was funny. Obviously, it's a terrible response. Okay, let's go to the next one, Andy.
So we won't vote for this because we don't believe it could ever be truly revenue neutral after the lobbyists get done with it.
Yeah, we hear that concern sometimes. I like what they did in B.C. What they did in British Columbia was that if all the money does not go back, the finance minister loses part of her salary. Okay, that's a good response, but then here's a better one.
We're not going to vote for this because we don't believe it could ever be truly revenue neutral after the lobbyists finish with it.
Yeah, we do hear that concern from other offices. There are plenty of people who bring this up. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you're concerned about that?
Well, the Democrats are going to want some money for Social Security, and the Republicans are going to want to pay down the debt. So what we'll end up with is just higher energy prices as we pay for other things.
Okay, so it sounds to me like transparency is important to you. Is that correct? Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. There's way too much waste and fraud.
Yeah, that's a big concern for us as well. There's some examples of how something similar has worked in other places around the world. Would you like to hear more about that?
Great. All right, so we're going to stop here and debrief this situation. And so the situation again here was the concern from the member of Congress that this will never be revenue neutral. Now notice what Mark did there again. He started with acknowledgement and he followed it by a question. He said, yeah, you know what? We hear this concern from some offices. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And what he heard and what he learned was that at this point, the member of Congress's underlying issue or value really here was transparency. So our responses to his comment about this not being able to get through Congress and staying revenue neutral have gone from the really bad response that we can't trust you to, hey, I like what they did in British Columbia, to the final thing, which was really, again, asking questions, listening for value so we could find common ground. And then we discovered that his real concern was transparency.
Exactly. So the important thing to take away here from the demonstration, it's not the content and the minute details, it's the process. Because when we're first presented with an object or concern, we're kind of naturally inclined to come back with a fact and sort of have that inclination to kind of prove ourselves right. But remember what Dr. Hale and others have taught us along the way. We have to connect on shared values before someone is going to be ready to accept what we have to say. So in order to determine what the underlying value is behind their statement, we ask questions to draw out more information as we go. We establish common ground by sharing our concern and connecting ourselves to that value. And then we actually ask for permission to proceed. And that helps them to get ready to hear what it is that we have to say.
Okay, so let's talk about climate denial for just a moment. And first of all, let's understand that only 7% of offices pushed back on the science 2 years ago and less than 4% last year. So it's something that almost never comes up, but it's something that we want to make sure we're ready for so we're not uncomfortable. So there are a lot of people who are probably concerned going in that they're going to get pushed back. You're probably not, but we should make sure that we're ready for it if it does come up. So we're going to demonstrate if the science comes up, a better way to manage the situation. And again, I want you to know it rarely comes up, but it's just one of those things where if you're nervous about it, then you're probably going to have a hard time relaxing the meeting. So it's important that we know that we're prepared so we don't get caught off guard. So I'm going to be the staffer this time, and I'm going to say, Andy, the satellite data shows the planet hasn't warmed in 15 years, so why should we do anything about this?
Look, 97% of peer-reviewed science papers say that it is warming, so you're ignoring the scientific consensus. So here I'm already starting an argument.
Okay, so then let me ask the same question. Andy, the satellite data shows the planet hasn't warmed for 15 years, so why should we do anything about this?
Well, I understand the science can be confusing. We've got satellite measurements, surface measurements, ocean measurements, and on and on. It took me a while to get my head around it. And if you'd like, we can set up a separate time to discuss the science of climate change or even get a climate scientist from a local university to join us. But for today, we're here to discuss a policy that will grow the economy, create jobs, save lives, and significantly reduce emissions. And that's something that I care deeply about. So even if we're not on the same page with the science right now, I think the policy's other virtues like job creation and saving lives are worth your consideration. Would you like to hear a little more about the policy?
Great. So of course there, Mark's going to say, yes, I want to hear more about that policy. So let's debrief that better response real quick. There's two key things here. First of all, Andy was not confrontational. He assumed the best or the best intent of the member of Congress, the staffer, and didn't try to challenge them. He acknowledged that science can be confusing without telling Mark that he was wrong. He extended a hand by offering to bring in an expert from their home state, and that's just a much more comfortable and less combative way of doing things. And it leaves the door wide open for breakthroughs, much more so than if you were just to say, no, you're wrong, or 97% of climate scientists say you're wrong. The other thing is that it's better to help them find a way forward on their own terms, not forcing them to agree to our terms. We believe that the climate is changing and man has something to do with it. But if they ended up supporting our policy based solely on the economic benefits, we need to ask ourselves, would we really care at that point?
Okay. Great. Okay, good. So if we've done our preparation correctly, there's very few things that they should say that should surprise us, but nevertheless, there is a chance that they're going to say something that's going to provoke us or alarm us or worry us. And what we want to make sure is that we don't overreact. We don't get too flustered if they bring up something that doesn't make any sense to us or if somehow you feel attacked or something. Please also assume that their concerns, their questions, their statements are genuine. Even if they're not, occasionally you're getting an aide who's going to do something called, let's see if we can get the volunteer to overreact. But assume that whatever they're asking you about is genuine, that it is something that they have legitimate concern, and that's the question they're asking. If you can eliminate our kind of innate bias to blame them, because maybe they've supported fossil fuel interests, and so we think therefore they're evil or they're not good people because they've done that. If we can see if we can put those things behind them and just connect with the person in front of them rather than our preconditioned biases about them, we'll probably have a better chance of connecting with them. And remember, this meeting is never about this meeting. It's this meeting as long as, in addition to 5 or 10 meetings from now. So we're always thinking long term. Please let them finish and make their point before you proceed and ask them to proceed. Particularly the members of the House and Senate aren't really used to, and they don't like being interrupted. It's not that I know anybody who likes being interrupted, but they particularly don't. So if we could let them finish their thought and ask them if we can say something after that, you know, if we show that we're really good listeners, it's much more likely that they are going to be interested in what we have to say if we've demonstrated we're good at listening to them. Next slide. Okay, good. All right, so here's a few things that sometimes people will be tempted to do that we recommend that you don't. So for instance, promising what you can't deliver. You know, you're in an office and they say, well, I think half the money should go to houses and half the money should go to reducing the deficit. And you're like, yes, we're going to do that. So please don't promise something that we're not actually going to do. Another is overstating our case. If you say, for instance, I know 100% of our district are going to come out ahead, it'd be really hard to find out a district where 100% of the people would come out ahead. So let's not promise things that it's just not the case. And then also asking for less than you want. You know, remember from webinar 301, we always want to start with asking for what we want. In every single case, we would like them to introduce or support our legislation. So let's never compromise and start with something that's small. Let's always start with the biggest possible ask, and then we'll come back if we can't get our biggest ask.
Great. All right, so we've gone through a lot of material already tonight. And what I'd like to do first is, let me go back, is stop and take a few moments to check for understanding and see if there are any questions. We have a few questions in the chat box, and I'll read those off in a second. But if you'd like to ask your question as well, just raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. I'm going to go ahead and read the first question that I have in the chat box, and then I do see that there is a hand raised by, who is that? By Peter. So Peter, I'll come to you right after we address this question here. And this question comes from, let's go with Gail. She asks, my congressman is concerned about who will write the details of the carbon fee and dividend policy. How should I respond to that? Mark, Andy?
Yeah, they will. So, I mean, we drafted legislation the way we would like to see it, but this is a bill that Congress is going to write. So it really is, in particular, Gail, if your congressperson is concerned about who's going to write the bill, we would strongly recommend that they get involved with that process so that they make sure that the things that they're concerned about end up in the legislation. We have a proposal. We've drafted it exactly the way we want it, but this is the bill that's actually ultimately going to get passed is going to be one written by Congress. So that would be some people from the House, some people from the Senate, and then we'll have to reconcile the two before it becomes law.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Also in the, well, let's go ahead. Peter has his hand up. So Peter, I'm going to unmute your line. Please let us know where you're joining us from and go ahead and fire away with your question.
Hi, thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
One of the big issues going on in our district is a conflict between those supporting CCL and those supporting labor. And this has to do with the pipeline that may or may not go through Iowa. And we have been reaching out to local labor leaders, not to try to get them to agree with certain of us about the pipeline, which we know is not a CCL issue particularly, and to build a relationship with them. And our congressman is supportive of fee and dividend, and also a supporter, perhaps a bigger supporter of labor. And it occurs that maybe it would be useful to bring up our first to tell the labor people that we're not for or against pipelines, we're just for carbon fee and dividend, and that will help jobs in the long run. But the question of what do these laborers do when all these carbon sources start to dry up is a serious one and affects a lot of people. Do you have any advice about how to deal with that when talking both with the local labor leaders and with our congressmen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate concern that also comes up in coal communities. And so there's some things that I think that it is important for you to say. One is our fee raises steadily over time. And so, for instance, in the coal communities, that allows for a generational transition. It's not going to mean the elimination of today's coal jobs, but it means that coal miner's son or daughter who's thinking about going into coal is actually going to educate themselves in a different area so that they can focus at other places where there'll be jobs. So let's understand that there's going to be a generational transition. The other is, no matter how you choose to mitigate global warming, costs have to go up. Ours is the only proposal that puts all that money back in the pockets of people who spend it, therefore should be stimulative for jobs, therefore good for labor, so that, no matter what you try and do, there's going to be costs. In our case, ours is the only one that actually then circulates hundreds of billions of dollars back into the economy, which is good for jobs and therefore should be very good for labor. Let me just see if Andy or Ricky want to add anything to that.
I would just say to be real upfront about acknowledging the concerns. 2 years ago at the conference, former Congressman Inglis made a point about exactly this when you go into a coal mining district and have this conversation. It kind of comes back to the question of not overpromising, and saying like, well, everybody's going to get a job instantly in renewable energy or something like that. They'll know that that's not strictly realistic. So just being real upfront about acknowledging their concerns is important to the long-term relationship building.
Yep, the only thing I would add, and this is just strictly coming from a Texas perspective, we get this question a lot, obviously, because of the same thing. There's a lot of laborers in Texas that are working on building the parts that must fuel the energy industry. From what Scott Nystrom, the author of the REMI study, told us is that these are, like Mark was referring to, these are really generational type of questions. It's not like they're going out of business. They're not going out of business anyways, but they're definitely not going to go out of business overnight. The questions that they'll be faced with, the energy industry, will be more like, okay, when Bob is 65 and Bob is ready to retire, do I hire another petroleum engineer or do I hire another mechanical engineer who can start building windmills and doing different projects? And the industry is already making these types of changes, and those types of changes will be reflected in the laborers that are out in the field as well. So, our economy is always transitioning and always will. We certainly need to be cognizant of that and take care and try to do as much as we can. But I think what the point Mark brought up about, no matter what happens, there's going to be an increased cost, and ours is the only one that gives that money back, and therefore is best for American taxpayers. I would agree with that. So Terry asked a question in the chat window, and then Lori, I'll come to you, and then we'll get back into the presentation. But Terry asked, on the tax issue, what if we acknowledge what they had to say, confer, and ask how they would distinguish between the two, tax and fee?
Brilliant. Brilliant. I'm glad I came up with that.
Absolutely. I think anytime you can motivate their sense of engagement and their sense of, they're there to legislate. They're there. That's what they're there to do. Even the staffers, they really want to be there in DC. That's like their thing. So anytime you can activate that motivator that allows them to be involved and challenges them on what would you do, I think that's a good thing. Andy, did you have anything you want to add to that? Or?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, great. Now, Lori's got her hand up, so we'll go to Lori, and then we'll get back into the presentation. Lori from Montana, I know. Oops, it looks like you're muted, Lori, but you got your hand up. All right. Well, we'll go on. Lori, if you want to unmute yourself later, you can raise your hand again, and we'll oh, wait, there you go. Are you there? No. Okay. We'll go and get back into the presentation then. All right. So next up, so just real quick what we've covered. We've talked a little bit about obviously some bad, good, and better responses and some common temptations to avoid. And next up, what we're going to talk about are really some hot button issues and how to get back on track if some of these hot button issues pop up.
Right. So in talking about this, the real issue is how to stay focused. We're going to talk about a few of the really intense issues like fracking, nuclear energy, and EPA regulations. These are all things that can elicit very strong responses from either side, and therefore they have the potential to bring a conversation off track. and just very much distract the direction you want to be going here. So Mark's going to go over some suggested good responses in Republican offices, and I'll give some suggested good responses if you're meeting with Democratic offices. But what we don't want you to do in any case is to be inauthentic, or to say anything that doesn't work for you, that isn't true to you. People are very good at picking up on that, and it just won't work. And as we go along, notice how we always try to redirect the conversation back to the reason that we're there.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with fracking. This is assuming that we're in a Republican office, and someone will say, and you will hear this, natural gas burns cleaner than coal, so people should be championing the shale revolution. A bad answer is we already know that natural gas is way worse than coal because there's so much leakage. A better response is to acknowledge, first of all, yes, it's true, natural gas burns cleaner than coal. That's always worked for people, for you to tell them that their answer is correct. If natural gas can be extracted without significant methane leakage, then it will be better than coal. We believe all fuels should be accountable for their costs. Would you like to hear a little bit more about how our policy has all fuels be accountable for their true cost?
Right. Now, in a Democratic office, if the issue of fracking comes up, it's going to be from a very different perspective. So you're more likely to hear something like, aren't you opposed to fracking? So a bad answer would be, heck yes, I participated in 2 fracking protests last year. We've got to shut it down. A better response would be, personally speaking, yes. But as an organization, CCL always remains fuel agnostic. We believe that if you include all of the external costs through a steadily increasing fee on carbon, then within 10 years, fracking just won't make any sense economically. So what do you think about holding all fuels accountable for their costs?
Okay, so let's talk about nuclear in a Republican office. So for instance, we've heard that Senator McCain, who's been very interested in climate bills in the past, says he won't be interested until nuclear is on the table. So we should expect that. So first of all, you have someone say nuclear has to be part of the conversation. It must be on the table. Bad answer is, didn't you just notice what happened in Fukushima? Nobody's going to respond well to that. A better answer is, and one of the things I say is, one of our advisory boards, Jim Hansen, is an absolutely strong advocate for nuclear energy. And actually, the science says that generating nuclear energy is safe. We as an organization don't take a position on nuclear. We take a position on one thing: having the burning of fossil fuels carry their true cost to society and letting the market determine what's viable or not. The economists tell us that with carbon fee and dividend, the percentage of nuclear in our energy mix stays about the same as it is now. Would you like to hear a little bit more about that?
So then in a Democratic office, you might hear something like, your report shows that nuclear will increase under your plan. There's kind of an implied accusation there. So a bad response would be, we got to get our energy from somewhere, very dismissive and curt. A good or better response would be, well, I personally have my own concerns about nuclear, but the National Academy of Sciences says that it's safe. So as an organization, we don't take a position on nuclear. We only take a position on one thing, and that's having the burning of fossil fuels pay their true cost to society. So how do you feel about the growth in renewables under carbon fee and dividend?
Okay, next issue is EPA regulations in Republican office, and as you're aware, there's a lot of criticism there. And someone might say Obama's Clean Power Plan regulations are going to raise costs and kill jobs. And a bad response is, we have no problem criticizing the president as long as people have their plan. What's yours? Bad response. Good, nice line, but bad response. A good response is, we agree that regulation is the least efficient way to deal with the problem. Our solution is 100% market force driven. Besides, if we enact our plan, we will have 2.8 million more jobs, 227,000 American lives saved, and 1.375 trillion in extra GDP at the end of 20 years. Do you think you could support that kind of market-based approach?
Then in a Democrat's office, you might hear something like, I think we should just let the EPA handle emissions through their regulatory authority. They've already got a plan in place. So a bad dismissive response to that would be, It's a farce. They started by judging 2005 levels. Those are way too high. They're only covering stationary sources. It's just not going to get us where we need to go. A better response would be, we support the president's plan and the flexibility that the EPA is giving states and allowing them to design their own response. However, we feel that we can achieve greater emissions reductions with a market-based approach that covers all carbon emissions and not just those from power plants. So what do you think about achieving greater reductions? So in other words, if the conversation starts to go off topic, respond to their statement, then bring it back to carbon fee and dividend by asking them a question. Invite them back onto the track that you want to keep the conversation on.
Okay, good. So now we're going to go through some difficult situations. See, we're going to prepare ourselves. We're going to plan. We're going to do everything to get ready. We're going to practice our laser talks and try and figure out how to make bad situations good. But listen, working with people is inherently risky, and sometimes things aren't going to go well. So we're going to prepare ourselves. Please don't blame yourself if it doesn't go well. Every single time we do this, we all get better, and we learn by the things we do well and the things that we don't do well. And we're not going to cover everything in every meeting, so let's find out what we did get done, review it, and then talk about what's next. And then let's be concerned about what we can control, not what we can't. So there's some things that we don't have control of. I've had sometimes angry aides, and they just were angry before we got there, and they're probably angry after we get there. So we're going to go over some of those situations and how we can deal with them to keep things back on track and get focused.
Okay, so the first is an angry volunteer. There have been meetings where CCL volunteer has gotten a little heated. It's understandable, it's very human, but obviously it can kind of hijack a meeting. So if a volunteer gets very angry and says something like, it's you guys in Texas, your oil companies who are stalling and making this worse, it's all about the money for you. You can step in and handle it by saying something like, look, obviously, we're all very passionate people. It's why we're here. And we're working very hard to get something done in time. Now, you were just saying that, so you're bringing it back to the staffer and inviting them to continue their line of thought.
Okay, good. So now let's talk about it where we get an angry staffer. We don't run into this as much as we used to. One of the really tough years for us was 2010. A lot of Democrats lost their House seats, and so there were a lot of Democrats who were very frustrated and upset about the people they knew and loved not being in office anymore, and sometimes they would take it out on us and tell us, stop trying to do big things. Why don't you do something small so we don't all lose our jobs? So the main thing is if they get angry, please don't get angry back. Please let them know you hear what you're saying. Some of the best ways sometimes to diffuse the situation is just say back to them what they're saying so that they know they're being heard, and then see if we can get back to discussing the bill. So it's just not going to happen that often, but if it does, just listen to them, repeat back what they said so at least they know what they're heard, and then see if you can bring it back to carbon fee and dividends. Okay, going off topic, one of my favorites. So the story I'm going to tell you is maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Amy Bennett and I took 2 of the interns in for one of their first meetings ever, and Amy and I were kind of like, okay, interns who've never been to a lobby meeting, we're going to show you, we're the 2 most experienced people in the organization, we're going to show you how it's done. So we go into the office, and the person who we're meeting with, energy was new to her portfolio, and she didn't know anything about it. But she'd been a former potato lobbyist, and she knew a lot about potatoes. And once she started talking about potatoes, she didn't stop. And it just went on and on and on and on. And I'm like biting my cheeks because I'm going to start laughing out loud, and I'm kicking Amy under the table like, what are we going to do about this? So finally there was, I mean, honest to God, 10 or 15 minutes on potatoes. I'm sitting there looking at these 4 interns like, oh, this is how a lobby meeting's supposed to go. So, these again are going to be really unusual, and if it's something where it's just out off track, you just have to wait for someone to just take a breath and jump in there and say, thank you so much. I'm really glad that we were able to learn about this. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit more about fee and dividends, see if you have any questions you have about it. So again, these are going to be really unusual that someone's going to be completely off track, and sometimes you are just going to have to interrupt. And that's what we had to do with the potato lobbyist. We had to just cut her off. We had to try and get the meeting back on focus, and then Amy and I had to apologize to the interns walking down the hall. This wasn't exactly the best training we'd hoped to give them after we told them we were going to show them how the pros did it. All right. Back to you, Eddie.
Okay, then pushback from like-minded folks. So you will meet with people who agree with you on climate, but aren't with us on every detail on how to deal with the situation. They may understand that we need to act, but favor different policy, or just have reservations about carbon fee and dividend specifically. So if you run into that, how do we handle it? First, show appreciation for the work that they're doing. They might have put in a lot of work on a different policy, and that's very important to acknowledge. Similarly, acknowledge that we all share a common goal and that their plan or ideas have value. Remember, it's very easy to get upset with people on our side who don't agree with the exact approach, and the small differences shouldn't let us forget that we're all ultimately on the same side. Always refrain from negativity and don't bash their plan or their idea. They're proud of it. They and their colleagues might have put in a lot of time on it. So just try to come back to something like, yes, we love that bill or that policy or that idea. We just think that for us to get done what we are trying to get done and what we need to get done, we need to keep our focus on one thing. But you're right, that should be supported as well.
Great. Okay, well then let me just say a couple things about what we're trying to do here. So there's some of you, I'm sure, who you're listening to this and you know you're about to go to DC for the first time, and I think that there's probably some degree of anxiety that goes with that, and I think that's probably good. I think it shows a respect for what we're dealing with in front of us. What we've really been trying to do as an organization over the last couple of years is get better and better at asking questions and listening to that. Part of that is in the hope we'll actually do it, knowing that when we get in there and we're excited, some of us are going to our mouth is going to take off and we're not going to know how to stop it. The other good thing is there will be hundreds of people who have come last year and the year before and the year before who are really experienced that will make it easier for all of us. So, we do want to open up the questions again. If you're feeling some anxiety about coming to your first time, I think that's a good thing. To me, I never, people who say they're never nervous about going in front of a room, I'm always nervous. I don't understand people who aren't nervous. I think you're not showing respect to the people you're communicating with if you don't have some degree of anxiety. So if you're feeling at all nervous about coming to DC, I think that's a good thing, because I think that shows a healthy respect for what we have to get done. And certainly we're going to prepare ourselves. We're going to practice our laser talks. We're going to do role plays. You're going to get a bunch of information before the conference, and we'll actually feel as comfortable as we do once we get there. Just know that there will be a lot of very experienced people in there with meetings with you who, if you don't remember an answer to one particular thing, they'll be there also. Okay, Ricky, why don't we open up the questions again?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Mark. So again, we're going to stop here, and we got, it looks like about 15 minutes or so to take questions. So again, if you have a question you'd like to ask or we didn't get to you last time, please click the little hand symbol that's in your control panel. You should see that circled in blue on your screen right now. Or you can type your question into the question pane on the right-hand side. So the first question that we have in the question pane, Mark and Andy, and this comes from Terry. And Terry asks, what if they ask us about our personal energy habits? I'll go first, and if you guys want to jump in on this, but again, I think that gets back to, I guess it's the spirit of the question. I mean, if it's at the beginning of the meeting and they're just being friendly and that kind of thing, sure. But maybe if they're trying to go off topic, I think you would handle it the same way that Mark and Andy were demonstrating. Acknowledge what they said, maybe even answer their question, but then turn it back to carbon fee and dividend and turn it back to the reason why we're there, because we really have very limited time to meet with them. So we do want to keep it as much as we can on topic. Mark, Andy, did you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I have a couple things. One is, when people ask me that, I do tell them that I ride my bike to work. I'm not doing it to make a big statement. I'm just lucky that I live in a place where I can ride my bike to work, so it's just a fortunate thing that I'm able to reduce my carbon footprint. But more importantly, I have traveled the country extensively, starting a lot of the chapters in CCL. Our people tend to walk the talk. So if you see our volunteers, they tend to do the kinds of things that one would do to try and be responsible. They tend to buy local. They tend to drive hybrids. A lot of them walk or ride their bike places. So there's a lot of the walking the talk if you actually get a chance to get out there with the membership.
Yeah, I would also add, and this might be something, it would depend on the tone, whether you wanted to say something like this, but it provides an opportunity to offer some appreciation, potentially, depending on the office you're in. Acknowledging that we do use fossil fuels and actually have some legitimate gratitude for some of what fossil fuels have allowed us to do. Probably personally and in terms of broader society. However, we feel that the time is right to start looking for alternatives to that so that we can continue America's long run of prosperity. I mean, again, it depends on what office you're in, but I have seen that sort of line pay some dividends.
Great. All right. Let's see. Bill's got his hand raised. So Bill, I'm going to do one question out of the chat window, so be ready. I'm going to come to you and unmute you in just a second. Linda asks, when will we know who will be on our particular lobby team? Mark, do you want me to address that, or do you have it?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Ricky.
So we're planning on getting the schedules, the meeting minutes, the bios, all the information that you're going to need. And the schedule, Linda, will have everyone that's on your team for each particular meeting and their phone number and the meeting leader's name and their phone number. We're trying to get all that information out to you guys the week before the conference. So you'll have time to, the leaders will have time to contact the different teams to maybe schedule up some times where you can meet either prior to DC or maybe at a lunch break in DC or a breakfast meeting to plan. So just be looking for all that information the week before your trip to DC. All right, I'm going to unmute you, Bill, if you'll let us know where you're joining us from today, and go ahead and fire away with your question.
Yes, Bill Marshall, Millington, New Jersey, Raritan Valley chapter. My question really relates to the road that you end up at if you're asking a lot of questions, which obviously is a good approach, and that is that you might be required to offer some information, or not required, but need to offer some information that you maybe didn't anticipate you would need to offer to actually satisfy the questions that you've asked. I'm just wondering how you might deal with that, or how we can best deal with that.
Okay, again, it's such a good question, so thoughtful. Thank you for asking that. The main thing is we want to say is don't make it up. So if you don't know the answer, tell them that we have a pretty extensive group of people here who can get them what they need. And if you don't know it or don't know how to get it to them, tell them we'll figure it out. So the main thing is tell them what you do know. If nobody in the group knows, tell them we'll find out and we'll get back to them. And it's a really important thing. One of the things I've always asked people to do is when they schedule a meeting with a member of Congress is to put a placeholder in their calendar a few days later so that if there are follow-up items, you know you've already got a placeholder in your calendar reminding you, oh, make sure and get all that stuff to them if you said you'd send them something. So, yeah, there's some things where, most of what's asked, somebody in that meeting's going to know. But it's not always the case. But we're happy to go research and get back to them.
And I would just add to that as well as, I love it actually when that happens, because then you can turn it into the next meeting. You can say, like Mark was saying, let us go back and get some more information. I really want to address that in a way that satisfies you. How about we schedule to talk about that again next month, and I'll come back with some more information. And so it continues that relationship. So, Andy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Thanks again for your question. We have a question in the chat window, a couple of questions. From Jeffrey asks, if this is the final lobby webinar, what should our top focus be to prepare ourselves between now and June 19th?
Great. So over the last 3 months of monthly calls, we identified 6 laser talks that were the 6 most common issues that came up between over last year's lobbying. So one would be to practice those 6 laser talks so that you're very comfortable. I mean, other things are likely to come up, but those are the most likely. And you can still get those action sheets from previous months from our website so that you can see what those 6 particular laser talks were. So practice those 6. And then the other thing is, when the bios and the meeting notes come after you, just take some time and review them so you feel like you're as familiar with the candidate as you can possibly be. Ricky, Andy, want to add something?
You know, I would add, and this is just me, but also practicing some questions. Practicing questions that, or even writing, having a set of questions written down, maybe even for every meeting for when you get stuck, because there will be, in certain meetings, there's times when things can just get stuck. So have like a couple of questions, and we talked about this in Lobbying 301, that prepares you, and just say them over and over, so then they become just pretty much just automatic. I would think that that's another thing, but like Mark said, just look over all the materials you're going to be sent and trust in your teammates. You are going to be with a fantastic team. I know I liken it to when I went to college and I thought everyone was so much smarter than me and I was going to fail and be this huge failure in college. And then you go to college and you get in the room, you're like, God, everyone's dumber than I am. So, I mean, I think it's, I think you kind of feel that, or you just realize that, you know what, it's not as bad. The anxiety and the emotion of what you don't know just builds up, and it just creates this negative feeling that you have before you get in there. And you walk out of that meeting, you're going to be just on cloud 9. That's all I'll say. Andy, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Just I'd say take any opportunities you can to talk to friends and family, about this issue and kind of about what CCL is after and what we do. Ultimately, going into these meetings, like there's a natural degree of nerves, but at the end of the day, it's a conversation. And so, there's all these fantastic materials to prepare with, but just practicing, just talking it through without kind of feeling like it's an exam is probably a good calming thing to do, just with anybody you have the chance to.
All right, let's see. Elise, we've got your hand raised. I'm going to come to you right after this question, so be prepared. Kathy asks, will we get information on bills currently in Congress that have CCL recommendations, and will we get a list of national organizations that have endorsed the CCL proposal?
We will go over existing legislation during the Sunday night lobby training with Dr. Richter. So we will talk about existing legislation. We'll talk about if there's anything that looks like there's on the horizon. I'm not sure what we're going to have in terms of endorser material. We will have a media handout for you to be able to show members all the op-eds we got last year and some of the major newspapers that have taken an editorial position. I'm not sure what the endorser handout looks like right now. Do you know anything about that, Ricky?
Yeah. It's coming along. I think it's just about finalized. And yeah, so there will be it's a front and back, and it'll have organizations who have either endorsed carbon fee and dividend or endorsing some type of climate action. It's going to be a one-page handout, and we're still trying to see if it makes sense to get all the endorsers for every particular district out to people. So that's another consideration that's taking place. And just one thing I'll touch on. You asked where about similar bills. Right now on my screen you can see I'm in community and I'm on the resources page, and on the left hand side you'll see all the different menu options. There's one menu option called reports, studies, and analysis. Wait a minute, I forgot what you just asked. I'm going to have to refresh.
Next one down, Ricky. Bills, resolutions, committees, and caucuses.
Oh, there we go. Okay. You asked similar bills. Yeah, so you'll see at the very top, the first two links. The first link is for bills that were submitted during 2015, 2016. They're similar to carbon fee and dividend. And then the next one down is the bills from 2013 and 2014. So you can go in there and it'll say, here's what the bill is, here's what it says, here's CCL's take on it. So you can be well versed in those things. Thanks for helping me recover on that, Mark. All right, so Elise, I'm going to unmute your line if you'll let us know where you're joining us from today, and just let us know your question. Elise, are you there? Okay, well, we're not able to hear you, so I'll, maybe you muted yourself. I'll go to another question in the chat window, and we'll come back to you in just a second. Dean asks, does the leaver, the person who's supposed to leave the ask, and that's something we talked about in Lobbying 301, are they the person that schedules the next meeting? If so, is that an electronic meeting?
It really depends. So who we want to have the next meeting is somebody from the district. So if you're from the district, let's say you're the liaison, and likely that the next meeting is actually in district, not in DC. So it's going to depend. Just because you're the person doing the leave behind doesn't necessarily mean you'd be the person scheduling the next meeting. Who we're always trying to empower is the liaison to each office. So, and we're trying to empower their relationship with their member of Congress. So ideally, we would like to continue to have a focus of one person who's our entry point to every office. So if you're the liaison, then yes, you would be the person scheduling the next meeting. But if you're not, then we're going to make sure the meeting notes get to the liaison and they know what we've told the office. If we said we'll come brief you about this and they said they want that, we'll make sure that that gets back to the liaison. I think, Ricky, we've probably got time for one more.
Yep, so let's see. There are no other questions in the chat window, and I don't see any hands raised. So I think you guys did a fantastic job. So I don't think there are any. Oh,
Okay.
one other. Wait, Elise, I see her hands back up one more time. Let me just check in with her to see. Elise, are you there? Okay. Well, must have been a fake hand, a fake out. All right. Well, let me just say this. First of all, thanks so much for Andy Beahrs and obviously for Mark Reynolds for being with us tonight.